Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside your house, and finding strangers setting up for a wedding on your land without asking, without paying, without even telling you. That's exactly what happened to me. Two sisters from my neighborhood, known for their arrogance and entitlement, decided that their big wedding day should happen on my property. They didn't rent a hall. They didn't ask for permission. They just invited over 100 people and marched onto my land like they owned it. I stood there watching in disbelief as trucks pulled up, unloading chairs, tables, and towers of flowers. Strangers hammered wooden arches into the soil, right into the ground I had worked hard to maintain. Caterers dragged in food trays, decorators hung ribbons, and a huge floral backdrop rose right in the center of my field. It was like a full invasion, but the sisters didn't care. When I confronted them, they brushed me off, telling me I should be honored that my land was chosen. They laughed at me as if I was nothing. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply opened the gate to my goat pen. What happened next shocked everyone. My goats, free at last, rushed straight to the colorful decorations, chewing through flowers, garlands, and expensive fabric like it was a feast prepared just for them. The guests gasped, the decorators panicked, and the sisters screamed as their dream wedding crumbled before their eyes. It was chaos, and it was justice. This is the story of how two entitled sisters learned the hard way that you can't just steal someone's land for your fairy tale wedding. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was already peeking over the horizon, painting the sky with soft golden pink. I stepped out of my front door with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, expecting the usual peace of my quiet land. Normally, all I would hear at this time of day was the soft bleating of my goats and the distant chirping of birds. My land had always been my sanctuary, a stretch of green field surrounded by a wooden fence, the kind of place where time moved slowly and life felt simple. But that morning the peace was gone. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Loud hammering echoed across the field, sharp bangs cutting through the quiet. Then came voices, dozens of them shouting instructions, laughing, and moving quickly. I frowned, walking down the steps of my porch, squinting at the sight before me. My land was no longer my land. It looked like someone had dropped a carnival right in the middle of it. White folding chairs were being lined up in neat rows, stretching across the grass where I usually let the goats graze. A wooden archway had been planted into the soil, wrapped in silk ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Florists scurried around, hanging long garlands of roses and lilies. There were catering tables with silver trays, a massive sound system being wired up, and people unloading boxes of decorations from vans. It took me a few seconds to fully process what I was seeing, and then it hit me like a punch in the chest. Someone was setting up for a wedding on my land. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe they had the wrong property. Maybe they didn't realize this was private land. My heart pounded as I marched across the grass, weaving between strangers who didn't even glance at me as they worked. They acted like they belonged here, like they had every right to hammer nails into my soil and scatter flower petals across my field. That's when I saw them. Standing near the center of it all were two women I knew, all too well, Corinne and her sister. Everyone in town knew the Karen sisters. They were infamous for their arrogance, their sharp tongues, and their constant sense of entitlement. If you gave them an inch, they would take a mile. If you told them no, they would laugh in your face and do it anyway. They thrived on drama and lived as if the world revolved around them. And now, here they were, dressed in glittering outfits, supervising the setup of their big wedding event in my land. I froze in disbelief, my coffee cup trembling in my hand. My land was not a venue. It wasn't for rent. It wasn't for parties. And it most certainly wasn't for the Karen sisters. And yet, there they stood, waving at workers, smiling for selfies in front of the arch, completely unbothered. I stormed toward them, my voice rising with each step. What in the world is going on here? I demanded. Karen, the older sister, turned lazily toward me. Her lips curled into a smirk, the kind of smug smile that made your blood boil. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said. "We're just setting up for my sister's wedding. Isn't it beautiful? Beautiful." I nearly choked on the word. "This is my property. You can't just waltz in here and throw a wedding without asking me." Her sister, today's bride, rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "Relax," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just for one day. You should feel honored. Not everyone gets to host something this grand." "Host?" I snapped. "I didn't agree to host anything. You trespassed onto my land and invited 100 people without my permission." They laughed. Actually laughed. The sound cut through me, sharp and mocking. To them, I was nothing more than an obstacle, a background character in their little fairy tale drama. Karen leaned in slightly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look, we already sent out invitations. People are on their way. The decorators are paid. The food is ordered. You really want to ruin a wedding over a little patch of grass?" My fists tightened at my sides. This isn't just grass. This is my home, my land, my rules. But they didn't care. They turned away from me, brushing me off as if I were some nosy neighbor and not the owner of the very ground they were standing on. The bride started posing in front of the floral arch, tilting her chin just so, while Karen snapped photos on her phone, giggling at how perfect everything looked around us. The chaos continued. Trucks rolled in, honking loudly as more workers piled out. Guests began trickling onto the property, dressed in shimmering dresses and pressed suits, walking right across my field without a second thought. Children ran across the grass, knocking over buckets of flowers, while waiters set up champagne glasses under a canopy I'd never seen before in my life. Every second felt more unreal, more insulting. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to grab every last chair and throw it off my land. But I stood there, shaking with fury, forcing myself to breathe. Because I realized something. The sisters were daring me to fight them. They wanted a scene. They wanted drama. If I lost my temper, they would twist it against me. So instead I stood very still, watching the arrogance in their smiles, the way they dismissed me as if I were invisible, watching my land transform into their playground, my soil being trampled by strangers, my air filled with laughter that wasn't mine. And deep inside, beneath the anger, a cold idea began to form. If they wanted to treat my land like a wedding hall, they were going to learn the price of it, and I knew exactly how to make them regret every flower they planted here. I turned my head slightly, and in the distance I saw them, my goats, dozens of them, staring curiously through the fence, their eyes wide, their jaws slowly chewing on grass. They looked hungry. They looked ready. And suddenly I felt a slow smile spread across my face. The sisters might have taken over my land, but they had forgotten one thing. It was still mine. And I had a secret weapon they would never see coming. I spent the next hour watching my land turn into a spectacle I had never agreed to. Every corner of the field was being swallowed by decorations and noise. 2 giant speakers were placed at the edge of the property, blasting test music so loudly it rattled the windows of my house. The once peaceful morning had turned into chaos, and I couldn't help but feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. The Karen sisters strutted about like queens of the world. Karen, the older one, wore a glittering silver dress that caught the sunlight, throwing shards of light across the grass. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she barked orders at the workers as if she was running a movie set. Her younger sister, the bride, wore a bright red gown with sequins that shimmered as she twirled in front of a mirror one of the decorators had dragged onto the property. They both looked like they had stepped out of some glossy magazine, but their behavior spoiled any beauty they carried. I approached them again, determined to make them understand they couldn't just take over my land. "You need to stop this now," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You had no right to come here. I didn't give you permission, and I want everyone out." The bride tilted her head back and laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that drew the attention of a few nearby guests. "Oh, please," she said, flipping her hair. "You're making a scene for no reason. What harm is it doing you? It's just for today. Don't act like this patch of dirt is so precious." I felt my face flush with anger. "This isn't dirt. This is private property. You've trespassed. Do you understand what that means?" Karen crossed her arms, smirking at me as though I were a child throwing a tantrum. "We've already spent thousands on decorations, food and flowers. Guests are arriving. Photographers are setting up. You think we're just going to pack up and leave because you're being stubborn? Be serious." Her words struck me like knives. It wasn't just arrogance, it was entitlement at its peak. They genuinely believed they were untouchable, that their money, their looks, and their inflated self-importance gave them the right to stomp over anyone in their path. I wanted to call the police right then, but something stopped me. I knew how it would play out. The officers would come. The sisters would cry and twist the story, painting me as the cruel neighbor who tried to ruin a wedding. The guests would vouch for them, and in the end, I'd be left looking like the villain, even though I was the one who had been wronged. So instead I held my tongue. I folded my arms across my chest and simply said, "You'll regret this." Karen raised an eyebrow and gave me a mocking smile. "Oh, I doubt that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a wedding to prepare for." With that, she turned her back on me and walked away, linking arms with her sister as they posed for more photographs. I clenched my teeth and forced myself to breathe. Anger boiled in my chest, but I reminded myself not to lose control. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to scream, to throw them out, to make a scene they could twist to their advantage. No, I wouldn't give them that. Instead, I walked slowly back to my porch, sipping the last of my now cold coffee. From there I had the perfect view of everything: the flower arches, the catering tables, the laughter of arriving guests, and the goats lined up silently at the edge of the fence. My goats were watching too, their eyes fixed on the colorful redecorations that swayed in the breeze. I could almost feel their hunger, their restless energy. They wanted out. As I sat there, the memory of the sisters' laughter replayed in my mind. The way they mocked me, brushed me aside, treated my land as if it were theirs, lit a fire in my chest that refused to go out. And that's when the idea solidified in my mind, cold and sharp. I didn't need to fight them with my fists or with the police. I had something far better. I stood and walked over to the goat pen. The animals rushed to the fence, bleating eagerly, sensing something was about to happen. I stroked the head of my largest goat, Bella, who pressed against me, affectionately. "Hungry, girl," I whispered. Her jaw moved slowly as she chewed, her eyes fixed on the flower arch just beyond the fence. Behind her, the others shuffled, pushing each other, restless and ready. The plan was simple. The sisters wanted to use my land for their fairy tale wedding. Fine, but my land came with goats, and goats were not polite guests. Before I opened the gate, though, I decided to give the sisters one last chance. Maybe, just maybe, they would come to their senses. I walked back toward them, my steps firm and deliberate. The bride was now standing under the arch, practicing how she would walk down the aisle. Karen clapped her hands, cheering her on, while the guests around them laughed and applauded. I stepped directly in front of them and raised my voice so everyone could hear. "This is your final warning. Leave my land now, or I promise you'll regret staying." The laughter that followed was crueler this time, more collective. The sisters doubled over, clutching their stomachs as if I'd told the funniest joke they had ever heard. Some of the guests even joined in, sneering and whispering to each other about how pathetic I looked. The bride straightened up, tears of laughter in her eyes. "You're unbelievable," she said between giggles. "Honestly, you should be thanking us. When was the last time you had this many people on your boring land? We're making it beautiful. We're giving it life. You should be proud," Karen added with a smirk. "Don't worry, we'll clean up after. Well, maybe, if we feel like it." The crowd laughed again, and heat rushed to my face. That was it. Enough. They had made their choice. They had ignored my warnings, mocked my words, and insulted me in front of everyone. I turned away without another word, my silence more powerful than any argument. As I walked back to the goats, I could feel their laughter following me like poison in the air. But I didn't care, because the next sound they'd hear wouldn't be laughter, it would be chaos. When I reached the gate, Bella nudged me again, impatient. I placed my hand on the latch and whispered, "Go get your feast." The metal clicked as the gate swung open. One by one, the goats began to step out, slow at first, then faster as their eyes locked on the endless buffet of flowers, ribbons, and fabric waiting for them. I stood back, crossing my arms, and watched with a calm smile. The sisters thought they had one. They thought their arrogance made them untouchable. But they were about to learn that on my land, I made the rule. My rules came with horns and hooves. The goats didn't hesitate once the gate swung open. Bella, the largest and boldest, charged forward with her head held high, as though she had been waiting for this moment all her life. The others followed in a noisy, chaotic wave, pounding against the ground, bleats echoing across the field. My one-scum herd had transformed into a furry army, charging directly toward the wedding decorations like they were storming a fortress. At first, no one noticed. The music was loud. Laughter filled the air, and guests were too busy sipping champagne and snapping photos of themselves under the floral arch. But I noticed, my heart raced as I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold like the opening act of a play. Bella was the first to strike. She reared up and sank her teeth into a string of white roses draped along the arch. With a violent tug, the entire garland came loose, petals fluttering into the air like confetti. Guests gasped and turned their heads as Bella chewed loudly, shaking her head with satisfaction. Then the rest of the herd arrived. Within seconds, a dozen goats swarmed the area. One climbed onto a chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. Another jumped onto a catering table, sending glasses tumbling to the ground. Two more tugged at the ribbons tied around the archway, chewing through the silk like it was nothing more than grass. The crowd's shock turned into panic. Guests shrieked as goats darted between them, snatching bouquets straight out of their hands. Children screamed and ran for safety. An older woman tried to shoo one goat away from a handbag, only for the animal to yank the strap into its mouth and drag it across the field. The bride, standing in her sparkling red gown, let out a scream so loud it cut through the music. "Get them out of here. Stop them," she shrieked, flapping her arms like a bird, but it was no use. The goats were everywhere, and no one could stop them. Karen stormed toward me, her face red with fury. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, pointing at the stampede tearing through the wedding setup. I didn't flinch. I simply shrugged. "Oh, just my goats enjoying their land. They live here, you know. You didn't think you could throw a wedding on their pasture without consequences, did you?" Her jaw dropped in disbelief. "You did this on purpose." "I didn't let them out," I said calmly. "I just opened the gate. They made their own choices." Her rage boiled over as she stomped her feet like a child. "You'll pay for this. You've ruined everything." But it was hard to hear her over the commotion. One goat had climbed onto the buffet table, its hooves sinking into the trays of food as it devoured a plate of salad. Another goat stood proudly on top of the wedding cake, smashing the delicate frosting beneath its hooves before leaning down to take a bite. The sound of crashing plates and clinking glassware echoed across the field as the entire feast was reduced to crumbs. Guests, it scrambled in every direction. Some tried to chase the goats, only to get butted in the knees or have their clothes nibbled on. Others gathered near the edges of the field, watching in shock as the dream wedding collapsed before their eyes. Phones came out, recording the chaos because Of course, in today's world, no disaster goes undocumented. The bride's screams grew louder as she ran after a goat that had snatched a veil and was dragging it across the grass. "That's designer," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. Another goat tugged at the hem of her gown, ripping a long tear down the side. She swatted at it desperately, but the more she fought, the more the goat pulled, until she stumbled backward into the dirt, her dress ruined. Karen tried to regain control, shouting orders at the guests. "Don't just stand there, get them out, push them back." But the goats weren't going anywhere. They darted left and right, too quick, too determined, too hungry. The more people tried to chase them, the wilder the goats became. Bella, my fearless leader, marched straight down the aisle of chairs, chewing through every bouquet tied to the seats. She looked almost majestic in her destruction, like a queen reclaiming her throne. By the time she reached the arch, half the flowers were gone, ribbons shredded, petals scattered across the ground like the aftermath of a storm. I couldn't help it. I laughed. I laughed so hard tears filled my eyes. For once I didn't feel powerless. For once, the sisters weren't in control. My goats had turned the tide, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Karen whirled on me again, her silver dress glinting as she stomped closer. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "We'll sue you. We'll destroy you for this." I tilted my head, smiling calmly. "For what?" "For letting my animals roam on my own land. Good luck with that." Her face twisted with rage. But before, if she could respond, a goat rammed into her legs, knocking her straight into a pile of knocked-over chairs. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen scrambled to her feet, her hair a mess, her dress smeared with dirt. The look on her face was priceless, shocked, humiliated, powerless. Meanwhile, the destruction continued. The floral arch, once the centerpiece of the ceremony, collapsed completely as 3 goats chewed through its supports. The entire structure toppled sideways, landing with a crash on the grass. Guests screamed and scattered as the goats trampled across the fallen flowers. Munching happily, the catering staff tried desperately to save what little food remained, but it was hopeless. Goats jumped onto the tables, knocking trays to the ground, where other goats immediately devoured the fallen scraps. The wedding cake was nothing more than crumbs, the champagne glasses smashed, the linens torn and stained. By now, half the guests had fled. The other half stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or record the madness on their phones. Some whispered to each other, clearly delighted to see the sisters finally brought down a notch. After all, the Karens weren't exactly loved in the community. They had made plenty of enemies with their selfishness over the years. The bride collapsed to her knees in the middle of the chaos, sobbing as she clutched the torn fabric of her gown. Her veil was gone, her dress destroyed, her flowers eaten. The perfect fairy tale wedding she had imagined had turned into a nightmare, all because of her arrogance. And me. I simply leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching my goats reclaim their territory. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lift a finger. I just let nature do the work. The Karens had wanted a grand, beautiful wedding on stolen land. What they got instead was a disaster that would haunt them for years. And deep down, I knew it was only the beginning of their humiliation. By the time the goats had finished their feast, the wedding grounds looked like the ruins of a battlefield. Flower petals lay shredded across the grass. Chairs were overturned in every direction, and food was smeared into the soil like mud. The once pristine arch was a pile of broken wood, gnawed ribbons, and drooping stems. My goats, satisfied and bloated, wandered lazily around the wreckage, some still chewing on the last scraps of silk or roses. The field smelled like a strange mix of trampled food, spilled champagne, and goat musk. Guests stood in shocked clusters, whispering and pointing, their fancy clothes stained with dirt and panic. Many had already started to leave, muttering about how they had wasted their time coming to the wedding of the year only to watch goats devour everything. Others lingered, not because they cared about the couple but because they didn't want to miss the drama. People love a good downfall, especially when it happens to those who thought themselves untouchable. The bride sat on the ground, her dress in tatters, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. Her hair, once a perfect wave of curls, was tangled with leaves and dirt. She clutched at the fabric of her gown as if holding it together would somehow restore her dignity. She looked broken, but beneath her sobs, I could sense a dangerous spark, the kind that promised retaliation. Karen, on the other hand, was fuming. Her silver dress was torn at the side, her hair a tangled mess, her face red with rage. She stormed toward me with her fists clenched, every step like thunder across the field. "You think this is funny?" she screamed. "You've destroyed the most important day of our lives." I stayed calm, leaning casually against the fence. "I didn't destroy anything. I told you not to set up on my land. You ignored me. My goats live here, they just acted naturally. If anyone destroyed your wedding, it was you." Her face twisted in fury. "Don't you dare put this on me." She turned to the crowd of guests, raising her arms dramatically. "You all saw it. This monster let his animals out on purpose. He wanted to ruin our day." But her attempt at swaying the crowd fell flat. The guests looked at each other unimpressed. A few even shook their heads. Everyone knew what kind of people the Karen sisters were: loud, entitled, and careless. Some guests had probably come expecting a disaster, and now they had one. They weren't about to defend the sisters' arrogance. One older man finally spoke up. "You shouldn't have used someone else's property without asking. Everyone knows this land isn't yours. What did you expect would happen?" His voice carried authority, and a few others nodded in agreement. Karen's eyes widened as she realized the crowd wasn't on her side. Her sister, still sobbing in the dirt, wailed, "This was supposed to be my perfect wedding. Why is everyone against me?" The bride's fiancé, who had been strangely quiet through all the chaos, finally spoke. His suit was stained with food, his tie askew, his expression grim. He looked at his bride with a mixture of pity and frustration. "I told you this was a bad idea," he muttered. "But you wouldn't listen. You said it would be fine, that no one would care. Now look at it. Look at this mess." His words seemed to cut deeper than anything I could have said. The bride froze, staring at him with wide, wet eyes. "You're blaming me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not blaming you," he said, though his tone betrayed his irritation. "I'm just saying you didn't think this through. None of this had to happen." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension between the couple. Karen jumped in, trying to defend her sister. "Don't you dare talk to her like that. This was all his fault." She jabbed a finger in my direction. But again, no one supported her. Instead, people started to leave in earnest. Cars revved in the distance as families packed up, unwilling to be part of the growing drama. Some laughed as they went, shaking their heads, clearly amused by the collapse of the so-called grand wedding. Karen realized she was losing her audience. Her anger bubbled over. She stomped closer to me, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I'll ruin you for this. I'll call the police. I'll sue you. You'll regret ever crossing us." I looked her dead in the eye, unshaken. "Call whoever you like. You trespassed, you destroyed my land, and you humiliated yourselves. I didn't need to do a thing." Her face twisted, but before she could spit back another threat, Bella trotted up behind her and nudged her firmly with her head, sending her stumbling forward into a puddle of spilled punch. The crowd burst into laughter, the last bit of humor before they left. Karen screamed in rage, covered in sticky red liquid, while her sister sobbed louder, her perfect day in ruins. I simply whistled, and my goats began to wander back toward their pen, their bellies full and their job done. By sunset the field was empty except for the wreckage. The sisters had retreated to a corner, screaming at each other while their fiancés and a few loyal friends tried to salvage what they could. Most of the guests were gone, taking with them the story of a wedding ruined by arrogance. I stood on my porch, watching the last cars pull away, the sisters' voices still echoing faintly. In the distance, my land was a mess, but it was still mine. And for the first time all day, I felt peace again. The Karen sisters had tried to take what wasn't theirs. They had tried to laugh in my face, belittle me, and steal from me. But in the end, it wasn't me who destroyed their wedding. It was their own arrogance. All I did was open a gate, and as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I couldn't help but smile. Because I knew this story wouldn't die quickly. The sisters had wanted to be the center of attention, and now, thanks to my goats, they would be, for all the wrong reasons. In the days that followed, the story of the ruined wedding spread through town faster than wildfire. It started with the guests who had recorded videos on their phones, clips of goats eating the wedding cake, tearing down the flower arches, and dragging the bride's veil through the dirt began to circulate online. Laughter followed each post, each share, each mocking comment. What was supposed to be the grandest wedding of the year had become the town's most entertaining disaster. People in grocery stores whispered about it as they shopped. Neighbors leaned over fences to gossip. Even the local cafe buzzed with conversations about the Karen sisters' goat wedding, as everyone now called it. The sisters' dream event, which they had boasted about for months, had turned into a permanent punchline. Karen tried to spin the story at first. She stormed into the cafe one morning, declaring loudly that I had deliberately ruined their special day out of jealousy. But instead of support, she was met with laughter. One customer pulled out his phone and replayed a clip of Bella chewing through the flower arch, reminding everyone that goats don't lie. Another joked, "Guess you should have sent them an invitation to." Karen stormed out, humiliated. Her sister fared no better. The bride, once so proud and haughty, now avoided the public eye altogether. She stayed inside, blinds closed, while rumors swirled that her fiancé was reconsidering their marriage. No one had forgotten the look on his face, that dazzle mixed of frustration and disappointment as he watched his bride scream over a ruined dress while the goats devoured their feast. Some said he was embarrassed to even show his face at work, where co-workers snickered behind his back. Meanwhile, I went about my days in peace. My land was messy, sure, but nothing a little work couldn't fix. The goats were happy, well-fed, and blissfully unaware of the drama they had caused. Every time I looked at them, I felt a swell of pride. They weren't just goats anymore. They were heroes. My little army of justice. The sisters, however, weren't finished. A week later, a letter arrived at my door, filled with legal threats that claimed damages, emotional distress, and loss of reputation. They demanded money to compensate for their ruined wedding. I laughed as I read it, shaking my head. They still hadn't learned. I contacted a lawyer who had no trouble dismantling their claims. They trespassed on your property, he said with a grin. They should be paying you for damages, not the other way around. When the sisters realized they had no legal ground to stand on, they fell silent, their threats reduced to bitter, muttering whenever they saw me in town. But the damage to their reputation was permanent. Invitations to parties stopped arriving. Friends who once clung to them for their money and showmanship now kept their distance, afraid of being tied to the laughingstock of the town. The sisters were isolated, their arrogance stripped away by the very people they had once looked down on. One evening I sat on my porch watching the sunset, a soft breeze carrying the sounds of crickets across the field. My land was quiet again, restored to the way it had always been, simple, peaceful, mine. Bella nudged at my side, chewing on a scrap of hay, and I scratched her head affectionately. I thought about that day, the chaos, the screams, the humiliation of the sisters, and I realized something. Justice doesn't always come from shouting or fighting. Sometimes it comes from patience. Sometimes it comes from standing firm. And sometimes it comes with horns and hooves, disguised as hungry goats. The Karen sisters had wanted their wedding to be remembered forever, and in a way it would be, just not how they had planned. Their arrogance had been their undoing, and the story of their downfall would live on as a lesson. Never steal what isn't yours, and never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who owns their ground. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, I smiled to myself. The chapter of the wedding was closed, but its memory would always bring laughter. My goats had taught the sisters and the whole town that entitlement has consequences, and respect for others is worth more than flowers, ribbons, or fancy gowns. The land was mine again. The peace was mine again, and the victory was sweeter than any cake the sisters could have ordered. The Karens had tried to take everything, but in the end, they lost far more than they had ever imagined. They lost their pride, their dignity, and the false image they had built for themselves, all because they underestimated the quiet man next door and the hungry goats behind his fence. And that was enough for me.